What would you do if a creature from legend, battered, trembling, and barely breathing, looked at you with the eyes of a lost child? In 1989, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Dr. Helen Carrow, a widowed veterinarian broken by grief and silence, chose exile in a wooden cabin far from the world. Until one stormy night, she heard a cry from the forest. What she found wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was something no one had ever dared believe in, a young Bigfoot, wounded and alone. And Helen chose to save it. As she nursed the creature, whom she named Wren, their bond grew. But when its towering father emerged from the mist, not to attack, but to offer gifts in silence, Helen realized these weren't monsters. They were guardians. This is the story of trust beyond species, of fire, rain, and a vow made in the quiet heart of the woods, where a woman's grief met a creature's instinct to protect. And in the end, when Helen was at her weakest, it was Wren, now grown, who returned to save her. When she was found, all that remained was a journal with a single final line. I was kept. So tell us, where are you watching from? How far can a story of compassion and wild connection reach? From the heart of the mountains, we send you this tale. With love. A sharp wind needled through the pine slats of the old cabin, setting the stovepipe to rattle softly against the fading light. Autumn dusk settled over Blue Ridge like a hush no one dared break. Inside, Dr. Helen Carrow sat alone at her kitchen table, hands ink-stained, head bent over a notebook lined with pale blue veins. A brass oil lamp threw a soft ring of warmth across the pages, the steady rhythm of her pen a small rebellion against the silence that had ruled her life for years now. She didn't keep clocks anymore, only dates, weather patterns, the arrival of crows, the moment the last light dropped behind the ridge, the sound of the wind shifting from west to north. She tracked it all in cursive, deliberate, gentle strokes, like someone trying to hold a conversation with a vanishing world. It had been nearly 8 years since she lost Luke in the fire. The mountain had swallowed him without giving anything back. Not a boot, not a bone, just ash, and the scent of burned timber that lingered long after the rescue teams gave up. Since then, she'd lived in this cabin like a shadow stitched to its frame. Quiet, careful, observant. Her days were simple: patch roofs, boil nettles, file case notes on injured hawks and broken-legged deer dropped off by the occasional ranger or backwoods hiker. She liked it that way. No surprises, just wind, ink, and pine. But that night, something shifted. A sound, low, wet, almost not a sound at all, rose beneath the choir of wind and rain. Not the keening of a fox, not the bark of a sick raccoon. It was something else, something smaller, more uncertain. Helen paused. Let the pen rest on the page. The dogs didn't bark. That told her something. She reached for her coat, oil lamp in one hand, the other closing around the old canvas medical satchel by the door. She didn't hesitate. She never did when something cried out in the dark. That instinct hadn't died with her husband. She moved fast down the slope behind the cabin, where the land dipped and the ferns grew thick under the oldest trees. Her boots sank into the wet earth. Rain tapped the glass of the lamp. The forest was slick with mist and shadows, 1,000 branches shifting like bones under the weight of wind. She listened, stilled her breath, then heard it again, closer this time, softer. A whimper, threaded with something close to singing. No, breathing, labored, shallow, just under the uprooted base of a pine where the ferns were flattened and streaked with mud. Something small trembled. Her light caught it. At first, she thought it was a bear cub, until it looked up. Her breath hitched. It had eyes, not just animal eyes. Human eyes, but not human. Deep amber, a color too wild to belong to anything that built houses or wore shoes. But what shook her most wasn't the color. It was the expression. The way its brow creased, lips trembling slightly, as if caught between fear and trust. A cry that never made it past the throat. It didn't reach for her, didn't run, just stared, waiting. She dropped to her knees, rain soaking through her jeans, and gently reached beneath its body. Her fingers found wounds, long, thin gashes down the back and side, clotted but still warm. The creature's fur was matted and slick with mud, but beneath it, the skin was pale. Not the thick hide of a beast. Something thinner, more vulnerable, more like her own. She wrapped it in her coat, holding it tight to her chest. It was so small, light, bones like reeds under her hands. Its head rested just beneath her collarbone, and she felt its breath against her skin. Labored, but still there. She stood carefully, the lamp swinging at her side. Then, her foot slipped. Not far, just an inch. But the ground beneath her boot made a sound she hadn't heard in years. Hollow, a thud that suggested depth, air, the absence of stone. She froze, looked down. The ferns had grown thick, but under them, yes, something unnatural, a pocket of emptiness, a shift in the earth that didn't belong to tree root or rock. She didn't linger, just filed it away, another note for later. She adjusted the weight in her arms and turned back toward the cabin. The rain followed them. Inside, the fire was dying, but the embers held enough heat to begin. She laid the creature, no, the child, on the cot by the hearth and fetched her supplies. Warm salt water, clean cloth, a wool blanket. Everything she did slowly, gently, as if the very act of caring might scare it away. It never moved, but its eyes followed her. Every movement, every glance. It blinked when she wiped the mud from its face, flinched when she rinsed a deeper wound near its ribs, but never snarled, never clawed, just breathed, each breath a little steadier. The more blood she cleaned away, the more she saw its face. Not a bear, not a chimp, not anything she'd ever studied in 30 years of wildlife medicine. The fur on its face was sparse, like the peach fuzz on a boy's cheek. Skin beneath it tan and bruised. Nose broad but human-shaped. Lips cracked. Jaw square. Its face was that of a wild child who had never learned words but knew the meaning of pain and mercy. And it was beautiful, in a way no textbook could describe. She covered it with a second blanket, then sat back, watching the flicker of firelight dance across the strange planes of its face. Her hands were still shaking, not from fear, from something older, something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper. She stepped onto the porch, the lamp casting a dim halo around her boots. The trees stood quiet, soaked to their roots, dripping from every branch. The wind had died. For a moment, it was only her, the quiet thrum of insects in the brush, and the sound of her own breath. Then, movement. Across the ridge, at the far tree line, a shape shifted. Huge, still, broader than any man she'd ever seen. It didn't move like a bear, didn't lumber, just stood, watching. The hair on her arms lifted. She didn't raise the light, didn't call out, just watched. The figure didn't threaten, didn't roar. But the shape of it, massive shoulders, long limbs, a neck that curved slightly forward like someone carrying weight, sent something primal through her. And the stillness, as if it had been standing there long before she noticed. Its breath was visible in the damp air. Slow, heavy. She could feel it across the distance. Grief, or something like it. She didn't know how long they stood there. Her on the porch, it on the ridge. Then, like a curtain drawing, the clouds thickened. The figure melted back into the dark between the trees. Gone. Helen turned, stepped back inside, and quietly locked the door. The creature? No, Wren, she thought suddenly, the name falling into her mind uninvited, was still asleep. She added a log to the fire, then sat beside it, notebook open on her lap. She didn't write, not yet, just listened. The rain, the wind, the soft rhythm of breath from the cot. Somewhere beyond the reach of firelight, the mountain was no longer silent. It had given something back, and something else was watching to see what she would do with it. She reached for her pen, began to write, and somewhere in the woods, something waited, holding its breath. The cabin breathed with quiet. Rain had passed some time before dawn, leaving the forest soaked and glistening like glass under a pale gray sky. Helen Carrow stood at the window in her old wool cardigan, the one with one sleeve longer than the other, watching the fog lift from the treetops like steam off a cup. She didn't write this morning. Her journal lay closed on the table, the ink bottle still corked. Instead, she listened. Inside the cabin, behind the wood stove where the cot was still half folded down, the creature she now called Wren stirred under the blanket. Not a rustle, not a cry, just a small breath-shifting rhythm, becoming steadier, becoming alive in a way it hadn't been before. She turned from the window, lit the lamp low, moved slowly, like in a church. Wren was smaller than she'd remembered, curled like a question mark, knees tucked close, fur still clumped from where she'd cleaned him the night before. She didn't know why she'd named him Wren. Maybe it was the way his breath quivered like the whistle of that bird that used to perch on her porch every April. Or maybe she needed a name for him so he wouldn't be a thing, so he wouldn't be something the world could unsee or forget. She warmed some milk on the stove, thinned it with boiled water, added a pinch of sugar, a whisper of salt. Let it cool just enough not to scald. She poured it into an old ceramic cup and sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, cradling his head with one hand and tipping the cup with the other. He didn't drink it first, just stared at her with those eyes like burnished glass, both afraid and resigned. But when the milk touched his lips, he made a low sound deep in his throat, a kind of sigh, and swallowed. Just once, then again. She didn't rush, a little at a time. Between sips, she hummed low. Not a melody, just something steady, the way she used to with her old horse when storms came. When the cup was empty, he turned his face into her sleeve. She didn't move. Just let him stay there. Outside, crows argued in the pines. Water dripped from the eaves in steady ticks. By mid-morning, he was sitting up, just barely, propped between a rolled blanket and the firewood crate. She offered him a small bowl of oatmeal mashed with honey and soft berries. He sniffed it, touched the edge of the bowl with a long finger, then slowly brought a bit to his mouth. The look he gave her afterward was not joy, not confusion, just something raw, like he wasn't sure if this was kindness or a trick. Later, when she stepped outside to gather more firewood, he crawled behind her, not fully walking, not yet, but moving. Every few feet he'd stop, turn his head, then scurry closer. She didn't speak, didn't reach for him, let him come when he was ready. The dog, her old mutt Bear, half blind and half deaf, sat in his usual spot by the hearth and watched without barking. Only once did his ears twitch. That was enough for Helen to take notice. She made a note of it in the margins of her journal that night. Just a single line. Bear heard something in the woods, low register, held his breath. By the third day, Wren had begun exploring the cabin. He liked corners, the space under the old rocking chair, the shelf where her extra blankets were folded. He climbed into the pocket of her coat once and refused to come out, just his eyes peeking over the edge like a child in trouble. She left him there for over an hour while she shelled beans and boiled root vegetables. Let him decide what felt safe. That night, after she stoked the fire and closed the shutters, she found him curled in the laundry basket with the dog sleeping beside him. The firelight made his fur shimmer where she'd brushed it clean. She didn't disturb them, only paused in the doorway, watching the rise and fall of two very different chests breathing in time. The next morning, something new. On the porch rail, just beside the lantern hook, sat a tiny braid of dried grass. Clean, deliberate, tied with a piece of bark string. No footprints, no scent of sap or disturbed soil. Just the braid. She held it in her palm for a long while. It wasn't from her yard. The grass was too fine, too smooth. Wild but handled. She didn't say anything to Wren. Didn't say anything at all. Just took the braid and placed it between the pages of her notebook, pressed flat against the entry from the day before. The following evening, it happened again. Another braid. This one slightly larger, looped at one end like a pendant. Alongside it, 3 pale hairs, long and coarse. Deer, not shed by accident, left with intent. Bear sniffed the air near the porch but didn't bark. Wren stood by the door for a long time that night. Not afraid, not curious, just standing. Listening, as if waiting for something he already knew. Helen didn't press, but she added another line to her journal. They are watching. That week, the temperature dropped. Sky turned the color of tin. Wind blew harder through the pines. Helen sealed the windows with oilcloth, checked the roof line, stocked the firewood twice over. At night, she warmed milk with honey, fed Wren in silence, wrapped him in an old green blanket that used to be Luke's. He didn't fight it. He began making a sound, just sometimes, when he was content. A low, vibrating tone, like a humming string. Not a voice, not speech, just resonance, deep, organic, almost like a cello if you played it with breath. Helen didn't know what to call it, but it made her chest tighten every time she heard it. It wasn't random. It wasn't noise. It was music, a language without words. Once she heard an answer. From the woods, a single, drawn-out note, barely there. Echoing, lower, farther, but there. Wren had been sitting on the porch rail when it came. He froze, turned toward the sound, his shoulders lifted. He answered. His own note, soft but certain. Helen stood behind the screen door, hand on the frame. The hair on her arms rose. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't need to. That night the sky stayed dark long after sunset. The clouds hung low, a blanket thick with hidden stars. Inside, Wren slept beside the fire again, his breath deep even. She wrote by lamplight. The line came to her like a truth already known. He is not an animal. He is a child of the forest. He knows trust. He knows calling. I must remain cautious, but my heart has already tilted toward him. The next morning she found a tiny print beside the door frame. Too long for a raccoon. Too narrow for a bear. Too deliberate. Pressed into the soft soil with care. It hadn't rained. No storms. No accidents. Just presence. Helen crouched down, pressed her hand beside it. The print was slightly wider, but not by much. Larger than Wren's, older. She rose without a word, brushed the dirt from her palm, and turned back toward the house. That afternoon, she gave Wren a fresh bowl of oats, cut thin with cream and sweetened with the last of the honey. He ate slowly, deliberate, watching her the way she watched him. The dog snored softly by the hearth. The rain had returned, just a mist now, brushing the windows like breath. Helen didn't light the lamp until the light faded fully. When she did, the walls glowed amber. Wren's eyes reflected it, like polished stones in a riverbed. Later, just before bed, she found a third braid, tied tighter. This one threaded with a single silver pine needle. She placed it beside the others. Not in fear, not in alarm, but like someone keeping track of prayers. The wind howled once, but only once. Then the night went still. That silence didn't frighten her. It settled around the house like something earned, something entrusted. And in that hush, Helen Carrow began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Not safety, not certainty, but tethered, not alone. The morning came quiet and heavy, with a silver mist lying low across the ridge like breath held too long. Everything outside was soaked in that kind of hush that comes only after rain and before decision. Helen stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of chicory and watched the light shift through the trees. Her boots creaked against the damp boards. The forest still looked asleep, but the air had changed. Not colder, not warmer, just alert. She could feel it in her ribs. That kind of awareness that moved through the bones before the mind could name it. Inside, Wren had begun to wake with a kind of rhythm, not just opening his eyes or stretching like an animal, but moving with purpose, his own small world growing wider each day. That morning she found him standing by the screen door, one hand braced on the edge, the other reaching toward the outside. His amber eyes followed the branches swaying in the breeze. There was something in the way he held his body now, taller, more sure, like he was listening for something only he could hear. Helen didn't interrupt. She just leaned against the doorway and waited. When Wren stepped barefoot onto the first porch board, she didn't stop him. He glanced back once, as if asking without asking. Then he moved forward, one slow step at a time, his shoulders shivering in the breeze, his fur catching the pale light like frost on cedar. And that's when she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just past the far line of pines. A shape. A presence that wasn't there a moment ago. Massive, upright, not moving, not hiding, just standing, framed by the trunks like a statue pressed out of dusk. Her heart didn't leap. It slowed. The way it used to when she'd watch a mountain lion pause mid-stride in a glade, unsure if it had been seen. The figure was tall, easily 8 feet, maybe more. Broad across the shoulders, arms relaxed but heavy at the sides. Fur darker than Wren's, more even, dusted in places with ash-gray streaks like old granite. It stood still, not a twitch in its stance, and when it turned its head slightly, she saw the face. Not fully, just enough to understand. The slope of the cheek, the deep-set amber eye beneath a low brow, a nose shaped like a man's, not a beast's. The skin beneath the fur was visible along the temples and across the bridge of the nose. Pale, weathered, alive. A human-like wild man face, intelligent, mournful, waiting. The breath left her in one long exhale. Wren had stopped, frozen mid-step. His posture shifted, not out of fear, but attention. He tilted his head, listening. His throat vibrated with that low, humming tone he'd begun to make the past week. A sound that felt like wind caught between rocks. The figure across the clearing breathed in. Broad chest rising slow, steady. Then exhaled with a sound like a sigh pressed through stone. It didn't move closer, didn't gesture, just remained, watching. Helen whispered a name. Not out loud, just in her chest. Arden. It came to her like a memory, though she'd never heard it spoken before. She didn't know if it was his name or simply what her heart called him, but it fit. Arden. A being carved from old forests and storms. A father. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. Wren moved closer to her, pressing his side against her leg. She reached down, ran her fingers gently through the fur on his back, and together they stood in silence, the space between two species bridged by breath and watching. Arden turned his head slightly, enough to glance toward Wren, then back to Helen. He lowered his chin, not a nod, not a bow, but something slower, a recognition. Then he stepped back into the trees, swallowed by the green in less than a heartbeat. She didn't speak. Not to Wren, not to herself, just turned back inside. But her hands trembled when she reached for her journal. That afternoon, she walked the edge of the property, checking fence lines she hadn't touched in years. Down by the old hickory near the creek, she found a rifle casing, half buried in the roots. Not fresh, weathered. Rust curled along the edge. It might have been years old, but it didn't sit right. Near it, on the trunk of a low oak, were markings. Not scratches, not random. She stood on her toes and traced them with the tip of her glove. 3 lines, one horizontal, one slashed at an angle, and a dot pressed below the junction. The pattern sat right at chest height for a grown man, or for something taller that knew how to signal. She stepped back, stared at the shape again, then made a small sketch in her notebook. Back at the cabin, Wren was sitting by the hearth, legs crossed like a child, sorting small stones into piles. He looked up when she entered, his eyes scanning her face. She didn't lie to him, just knelt beside him and placed the casing on the floor. He looked at it for a long time, then made a soft sound, low and flat. Not pain, not fear, just recognition. That night, another braid appeared on the porch rail. This one was tighter, woven with a kind of care she hadn't seen in the others. Alongside it, 3 more deer hairs, white, long, and a curved feather tucked between the strands. She pressed the braid gently between her palms and placed it on the mantel, not with her notes. Not this time. It felt like something different. Not just a sign, a message. We're here. We know. Keep him safe. She didn't sleep much that night. Sat by the fire long after the embers cooled, thinking of Arden's face, the way his eyes had passed between her and Wren, the breath that seemed to carry not just air, but memory. She imagined what he'd been through, what he'd lost, how many winters he'd carried grief on his back, how many times he'd waited at the edge of trees for a sign that his son was still breathing. Morning came slow. Cold air slipped beneath the door frame. Wren was already awake, sitting by the window, watching the pines. He hummed once, low and soft, and waited. Nothing answered, but his face didn't fall. Helen knelt beside him and placed a hand over his. Not words, just contact. He turned slightly and laid his head on her shoulder. The forest had given her something fragile and fierce, and now the forest was watching to see if she could keep it. Somewhere in her heart, she understood the terms, and she accepted them. Outside, a raven cried once, and across the ridge, far beyond where eyes could reach, something answered, not in voice, but in stillness, as if the earth itself had exhaled. Under the crushing heat of late July, the mountain turned brittle. The winds that once brought mist down from the ridges now carried the dry, restless scent of pine needles baking under a ruthless sun. Even the birds fell quiet by midday, and the stream that ran behind Helen's cabin had thinned to a tired trickle, its stones bleached and warm to the touch. It had been months since Arden last appeared, but the signs, carefully placed grass braids, deer hairs, the occasional print near the woodshed, never stopped. Some days Wren would hum into the trees, a low, wavering sound, and Helen would swear something answered, not with a sound, with stillness, with breath held in the forest's lungs. Then, one dry Wednesday morning, 3 men arrived at the gas pump in town with gear too clean and stories too loud. They weren't from Blue Ridge, not even from Buncombe or Haywood. You could hear it in their vowels, flat and drawn, tight like wire. Helen watched from the feed store window as they leaned over the tailgate of a mudless pickup, passing around topo maps and long-neck bottles. One wore a ball cap stitched with a snarling bear. Another had a hunting knife on each hip. The third said nothing, just nodded and squinted toward the hills. That night, she bolted her door before sunset. Not out of fear, out of habit from another lifetime. The next morning she walked the northern boundary of her land and found something off. A snare, half set, buried under a mossy cedar stump. New cord, nylon and steel, tied with a kind of precision that said these men didn't come to chase shadows. They came to trap something real. When she stepped back from it, her foot sank half an inch into dry loam. And she heard it, the echo, hollow, faint, like breath under the earth. She marked it in her mind, but didn't linger. Not now. That evening, as the sun sank red behind the western ridge, smoke coiled upward, thin at first, then thicker. The scent reached her porch before her eyes did, acrid, sharp, not like chimney smoke or a controlled burn. Wild. She felt it in her throat before she saw the glow between the trees. Somewhere above the southern slope, a line of fire had found its rhythm, carried by the wind. Greedy. Fast. Helen didn't panic. She moved, took down the bag by the door, stuffed it with the small essentials, wound care, water flasks, extra wool, and called for Wren. He came without question, barefoot and alert. His amber eyes locked on hers. Behind them, the dog growled low. No bark, just warning. In the distance, something cracked like bone. A tree falling, maybe, or a trap sprung too close. They ran. Not downhill, not toward town. Toward a hollow Helen had passed years ago on a field survey. A narrow rock alcove, shallow but shielded, tucked beneath the arms of a half-collapsed pine. The route was rough. No trail, no markers. Just instinct and memory. Wren kept pace beside her. Not fast, but deliberate. Like he knew where she meant to go. When they reached the clearing below the rock ledge, the smoke had thickened. Heat shimmered above the tree line, bending light in strange ways. And then came the sound, heavy, urgent, not fire, not wind. Something moving against both. Arden. He broke through the haze like a ghost sculpted from soot. His shoulders shone with sweat, chest rising in fierce pulls. He didn't slow as he reached them, just took his place between the advancing flames and the hollow mouth of the stone refuge. He didn't roar, didn't growl, just stood, one arm extended slightly back as if to shield. In the heat light his fur looked darker, clinging to his frame in streaks. His face was streaked with ash, but his eyes, those amber eyes, were crystal clear, fixed on the smoke like it owed him something. A shot rang out, sharp, too close. It missed the fire, missed the trees, caught Arden's shoulder as he turned. Not enough to fell him, but enough. The bullet tore past his upper arm, blood dark and fast across his fur. He staggered, caught himself with one hand in the dirt, and rose again. No scream, just breath, rough and angry. Helen stepped forward, reaching for the pack at her side. Wren moved too, pressing himself into Arden's flank, his small hand gripping his father's arm. The air shuddered. Rain began, first as mist, then as drops, fat and heavy. The wind howled once, and then the skies cracked open with the force of something owed. Water slammed down. The fire hissed and rolled back, and beneath their feet, movement, not animal, earth. The same hollow thud as before, now louder. The ground beneath the burned edge of the slope began to slip. Cracks opened like mouths. One of the hunters screamed. Helen turned just in time to see the ridge give way, roots tearing like rope, mud folding in on itself as if the mountain had decided to breathe out. The edge of the hill collapsed, dragging brush, flame, and one of the men into a raw, gaping pit. Dust clouded the air. Then silence. Only the sound of rain on rock, soft and absolute. Helen dropped to her knees beside Arden, tore open her satchel, pulled what gauze and alcohol she had. His wound was deep but clean. Through it all, he didn't flinch. just watched her work with a kind of stillness that made her hands steadier than they had any right to be. Wren pressed his forehead against Arden's arm. A quiet gesture. Not panic, not grief. Just presence. Helen rested her hand over Wren's, then looked up. Arden met her gaze, and then he did something she would carry in her chest for the rest of her life. He lowered his head, slow, deliberate, and let his forehead touch hers. Just once, just long enough to say what couldn't be spoken. When it passed, the fire was out. The rain softened to mist. Around them, the trees hissed with steam, smoke rising like ghosts from the roots. Helen wrapped the shoulder tight with cloth torn from her own sleeve. Her knuckles brushed the old scar on her forearm, the one from the bear trap years ago, that never quite healed smooth. She remembered it now, the bite of fear, the confusion, the betrayal of pain in a place she had meant only to help. This moment was not that. This was a vow, not spoken, but understood. She stood beside him until his breath slowed, until his body relaxed just slightly, until Wren curled into his side like a sapling finding its shadow. The night came heavy and wet, carrying the scent of burnt cedar and dampy soil. None of them spoke, but everything had changed. The forest had burned, but something else had been sealed in its place. A covenant, quiet and deep. A promise carried on 3 steady heartbeats, and the sound of rain sinking into earth that remembered everything. The first cold of autumn came early that year, brushing the tops of the Blue Ridge with a silver breath that turned the leaves brittle before they ever flamed. Helen could feel it in her joints before sunrise, and in the way Wren clung to her coat longer in the mornings, burrowing his narrow frame against her ribs like he was bracing for something that had no name. Arden hadn't returned to the cabin since the night of the fire, but his absence wasn't emptiness. It was distance. Chosen. Needed. She'd seen the wound heal in stages, watched Wren's ears twitch at sounds she couldn't hear, seen him listen with his whole body pressed flat to the wooden porch boards when the wind shifted from the north. And when the time came, she didn't question it. She packed quietly, not too much. A tin of dried apples, her old canvas field kit, Wren's blanket. She left a note for old Edna at the general store, said she was heading upridge to collect wild burdock and hawthorn before the frost. Nobody would think twice. She'd been wandering these hills longer than most folks had been alive. That morning, just before the light touched the valley floor, the 3 of them left the cabin behind. The woman, the boy, the father. One with boots, one barefoot, one silent in the trees. They moved like breath through the undergrowth. No trail, no compass, just the pull of something ancient and alive, like the way geese knew where south was, even in fog. Wren walked with a steadiness Helen hadn't seen before. Not quite grown, not quite child, but carrying the rhythm of something older. Arden let him walk ahead sometimes, but never far. His gait had changed too, slightly favoring one side, the shoulder where the bullet had carved its story into him. But he never showed pain, only pause. At midday they crossed the narrow bend of a dry creek bed, and Helen caught herself remembering something she hadn't thought of in years. She was 23, newly hired at a wildlife center just north of Asheville. They brought in a bear cub, foot mangled in a snare, and no one could get close. She waited, sat by its cage day after day. No eye contact, no food tricks, just waiting. Until one morning the mother arrived. No one knew how. No radio collar, no tracking device. She came through 3 fences and a storm. Helen was the one who opened the gate. The bear didn't look at her, just walked past, gathered her cub, and turned. On the way out, her shoulder brushed Helen's. Not a warning, not thanks, just a moment. Then she was gone. That same week, Helen cracked 2 ribs from a panicked cougar charge and spent the next month in bed, swearing she'd never trust her instinct again. But she had. again and again. And now, watching Arden lift Wren over a wide patch of thorned underbrush, she saw the same silent calculus, the same weight, the risk, the love. That evening, the wind picked up, swirling leaves across the pathless slope. Wren began to hum again. Not the low sound he made in the cabin, but something stretched and high, like a note held between breath and bone. Helen stopped to listen. Arden did too. The sound threaded into the trees and vanished. Then came an answer, not close, not loud, but definite. A faint rhythm, like wood brushing wood. Deliberate, slow. Chick-chick-chick. Pause. Chick. Not natural, not wind. A message. Helen turned toward the sound, heart moving like a second pulse in her ears. Arden looked at her once, then pressed his palm to the base of a beech tree and left it there for a moment, listening. The forest didn't echo. It absorbed, swallowed every step, every breath. But the message had been received. The sun slipped behind the ridge, dragging the color out of the world. They walked without speaking, each step folding them deeper into the unseen. Night fell, no lanterns, no fire, just stars, cold and full. In the distance, eyes began to appear, not glowing like stories told in fear, but catching light in silence. Pairs, at first one, then three, then more. They didn't move forward, didn't circle, just stood. A quiet line of watchers behind trunks and branches and bramble. Helen's breath caught, not from fear, but from something heavier, something holy. She felt Wren still beside her. He wasn't afraid. Arden stopped. Raised a hand, not a signal, not command, just presence. The trees grew tighter. The path narrowed. Then the world opened. A shallow hollow between two arms of shale, curtained in moss and windfall. The air shifted here. Softer, shielded. Helen paused at the edge. Arden stepped forward and stopped. He didn't speak. He never had to. He turned, and with a gesture as simple as turning a page, pressed the back of his hand against Helen's. Not hard. Just enough that she felt the warmth. Then his head lowered, and he brought his brow to meet the back of her hand. His eyes were wet, not from pain, not from injury, from something that ran deeper, a kind of thank you that came not from words, but from weight shared. Wren stood behind him. When Arden stepped back, Wren moved forward, pressed his own brow to the exact spot his father's had touched. A child's goodbye, but also an echo, a promise. Helen stepped back. She didn't cry. She didn't reach for them. She knew this part had to be theirs. The forest closed behind them, not with force, but with quiet. Branches shifting, air folding in. She stood for a long time, until the wind returned to its usual shape, until the trees stopped watching. Then she turned, walked back the way she came. The trail was no clearer than before, but she knew where her feet were meant to fall. Behind her, something ancient had been restored, something sacred. And ahead, the cabin waited, not empty, but changed. And in the soil, still soft from rain, her footprints joined the earth like threads returned to their stitch. She patched the roof herself the following spring, just before the black flies came down from the ridge. The wood was soft along the north eave, moss working into the grain after years of wet winters and leaf rot. She cut the slats clean, hammered slow, deliberate, every nail head dark with sweat from her palms. The ladder swayed more than it used to. Her knees stiffened quicker, but the work held. That was enough. Below her, the forest moved the way it always had, without explanation, without apology. She didn't call out anymore. She didn't listen in the same way either. There were no answers expected, just presence. The cabin settled into those quiet years like a page between chapters. She sowed native flowers along the edge of the porch. Nothing flashy, blue vervain, wild bergamot, A few patches of gentian from seed. They didn't bloom loud, but they stayed. That meant more to her now. A kind of endurance that didn't ask to be seen. Edna from town came by once a month with goat milk and hard rolls, the kind Helen liked with the burnt edges. The old woman never asked much, never stayed long. She just placed the basket on the top step and left with a nod that carried more weight than most words. Helen gave what she could in return. Chamomile bunches. A salve that helped Edna's knees through the colder months. Some stitching on a canvas satchel too sentimental to toss. She liked that kind of trade. Clean. No debt. No favor owed. In those first months after the parting, she didn't dream much. Or if she did, she couldn't keep hold of them. But sometimes, after long rains, she'd wake to the sound of the wind bending the pine tips outside and feel a pull. Not a memory. Not quite. Just that sense that something had passed close. Never inside, never near, but enough that the air shifted. She never questioned it. And then one morning, after a night of steady rain that left the whole mountainside smelling of wet bark and lichen, she stepped onto the porch with a mug of steeped pine needle tea and saw it. A long curve etched into the soil just beyond the first step. Not deep, not careless. A sweep like someone had passed by with a long, deliberate gait. The dirt hadn't been washed out by the storm. It was fresh, wide, quiet. She crouched beside it. The distance between steps was too far for a man, too even for a bear. The edge of the print curved not with claws, but with the impression of a bare heel. Long toes, measured, heavy. She said nothing, didn't call into the trees, just looked once more, and then turned back inside. On the kitchen table, still dry despite the rain, lay a braid of clean grass. Tucked into it, 3 deer hairs, pale and perfectly aligned. She opened her notebook to a blank page and pressed it there without writing a word. There were stories in town, of course. You couldn't live in these hills and not hear them. A farmer down by the southern pasture claimed something had run off his dogs without a sound. Left a circle of flattened grass near the pen, but no blood. Just silence. A boy from up near Buckhorn Gap said he'd gotten turned around in the fog, but found a dry path laid with broken sticks leading him straight back to the road. The father didn't believe him, but the boy swore. Helen sat through those tales with a straight face, no smile, no correction, just the kind of listening that made people think twice about calling her crazy, and not quite bold enough to ask what she knew. The forest had always had its own way of watching back. They'd just forgotten how to feel it. She kept her hands busy, repaired chicken wire for the howls, set 2 broken wings on a pair of barred owls that had tumbled out of a storm with their pride cracked in half. She got paid in eggs, pickled beets, a few jars of honey. No money changed hands. She preferred it that way. There was something more honest in a dozen brown eggs than any folded bill. One afternoon, in the thick lull of summer heat, she sat on the porch with a dog curled at her feet, eyes half closed, when a sound came from deep in the trees. Not a call, not a cry, just a shift in pitch. A low hum like something had brushed the air wrong. She closed her eyes, waited. Then, very softly, she gave a single note back, low, drawn from the belly. Not perfect, but true. The forest paused, then exhaled. A breeze moved through the clearing like a breath released after too long held. She didn't try again. That wasn't the point. It was never about summoning, only remembering. That fall a new braid appeared beside the door. This one thinner, tighter, a pine needle woven through. She placed it on the mantel, next to the others, and lit a candle beneath it. She didn't speak, but in her chest, something leaned forward and listened. On the coldest night of that year, when the frost held the windows in a quiet grip and even the fire seemed to crackle slower, she sat alone with a blanket over her shoulders and opened the last page of her journal. She wrote 2 words in ink that never bled. I was kept. Then closed the book and rested her hand over the cover for a long time. She didn't need to explain what it meant. Not to herself, not to anyone. The next morning, she stepped into the clearing and found a small stack of river stones arranged at the base of the porch. No footprints, no drag marks, just 3 stones, flat and dry, one atop the other. She left them where they were. Let the rain kiss them, the frost claim them, the sun bleach them. They belong to the earth now, like everything sacred eventually does. The wind moved through the trees that day in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not urgent, not wild, just present. A kind of company without footsteps. And in that quiet, Helen Carrow sat on her porch, wrapped in wool, fingers ink-stained and still, and listened to the mountain breathe. The wind came in heavy from the south, slick with the scent of iron and moss, and it hit the cabin like breath held too long. Helen felt it in her teeth before she saw the sky shift. She was already half a mile deep in the woods behind the old quarry, looking for skullcap and goldenrod before the flood bloom, her boots slick with leaf mold, her shoulder damp with fog. She didn't mean to stay out so long, but the way the clouds had dropped wasn't natural. It was too fast, too low, and it carried a silence that didn't belong. When the first thunder rolled, it didn't growl. It snapped like something splitting bone. She turned for home without finishing her gathering, the medicine satchel thudding light against her back. Her legs carried the memory of the trail better than her eyes did. The forest was darker than it should have been. Pine needles clung to her coat, and her breath came out in short steam bursts. She wasn't young, and this storm wasn't one she trusted. The creek was swollen by the time she reached the edge of the clearing. The cabin roof glistened black under a sky that had gone full bruised charcoal. She'd seen this kind of sky before, but not often. Storms like this came with warning if you knew how to listen. But this one hadn't whispered. It had watched, waited, then dropped. She made it to the porch just as the wind snapped a branch against the side of the house. Rain started as a hiss, then a rush, then a pounding drumbeat that covered the roof in sheets. Inside, the dog paced. He didn't bark, just walked in slow figure eights between the door and the hearth, ears back, tail low. Helen leaned against the door frame and closed her eyes. The light flickered. The stove hissed as if the wind were inside it. The scent of wet wood and pine smoke curled around her. That's when she heard it. Not thunder, not wind. A sound from deep in the trees, a grunt, short, guttural. And then another. She moved toward the window slowly, squinting past the streaked glass, but saw nothing but a wall of water and shadow. Then a flash of lightning ripped across the sky, and in the blink of light, she saw it. Just for a second. Something massive moving through the brush at the far edge of the clearing. Fast, unsteady, not toward the cabin, angled, like something tracking something else. And then another figure, larger, slower, and closer. Her stomach dropped. She grabbed her flashlight, not that it would help, and yanked her coat back on. There wasn't time to think. Her body moved without asking, down the steps, through the mud, into the storm. The trees thrashed overhead like they were caught in some old rage. Rain stung her cheeks. Somewhere up ahead, something thrashed through the brush, and she heard a bark. Not the dog's. Something wild, high, then something else. A low roar, deep as gravel in the gut. She crested the ridge above the hollow and slipped. Her foot caught on slick rock, her knee slamming into a root hard enough to send a white flash up her spine. She slid down into the mud, landed hard, then pushed herself upright. Her leg was bleeding, the cut deep, but not life-threatening. Not yet. Lightning cracked again, and that's when she saw them. A boar, wild, thick-shouldered with red-rimmed eyes and foam at its mouth. Behind it, 2 hounds, lean and frantic, their flanks soaked and ribs sharp. They were cornered, not hunting, and to her left, moving slow, shoulders low, was Arden. Taller than she remembered, soaked to the bone, fur clinging to every line of his body. His breath fogged the air in front of him. His eyes were steady, not afraid. He stepped between her and the animals without hesitation, placing his full frame across her wounded leg. The boar hesitated, snorted, but didn't charge. The dogs barked once more, then bolted into the brush, spooked by something neither woman nor beast could name. Arden didn't move. He just stood, the rain carving rivers down his face. His hand opened once, slowly, palm facing the ground. Not a command, a promise. She was safe. Then Wren came from the far tree line, his fur darker now, longer, his limbs more sure. He moved like someone who had learned to walk among stars and stones alike. He circled wide, flanking the boar without drawing near. He didn't growl. He didn't yell. He hummed. A low, vibrating note that rolled out into the storm like a memory. The boar twitched once, then turned, and vanished into the brush, swallowed by rain. Arden turned back to Helen. She was shaking now, not from fear, but from the sudden stillness that always follows when danger passes like a wave. He crouched, his massive frame somehow delicate in the way he lowered himself. He touched her leg, examined the wound, then nodded once. Wren stepped forward with a handful of clay, dark, soft, scooped from the creek bank, and began to smear it along the edges of the cut. Then, with a fingertip, he drew a long arc around her body in the mud. Not a circle, a crescent. She didn't ask why, but something about it settled her breathing. Arden reached down and pressed his brow gently to her shoulder. Not long, just enough. A thank you, a confirmation. We are still here. We still see you. Then he lifted her, carefully, as if she weighed nothing, and carried her through the mud, back up the incline toward the road, toward the edge of the old trail where the wagon path used to split. He laid her gently beside the old white oak, the one shaped like a tuning fork, the bark smooth from wind. He stepped back, let her be. The rain eased. The sky broke open in patches. She blinked, and they were gone. Only a smear of clay on her calf, a fine hair stuck to her coat sleeve. Not fur, a gift. When she pulled herself upright against the tree and looked back down the path, the forest was quiet. Not empty, but complete. That night, back at the cabin, she bandaged her leg with boiled strips of linen and a touch of comfrey. The pain was deep but dull. It wouldn't scar badly. On the table, her journal lay open. She didn't write right away, just stared at the page. Then, slowly, she dipped her pen, and in a hand that trembled more from emotion than age, wrote one line. They kept me safe. She blew on the ink. Closed the book. The wind rattled the shutters once, then died. And somewhere far off, in the ridges beyond the rain, something hummed once more, long, low, and true, like a lullaby passed down through trees. And for the first time in years, she slept through the storm. By the time frost returned to Blue Ridge, the cabin had gone still. Not empty, just quieter in the way that comes when a life has grown full and then begun, gently, to fold itself inward. The porch boards no longer creaked with boots before dawn. The fire took longer to start, and no one cursed the wind through the chinks in the windows anymore. Inside, a single lamp glowed beside the worn table, its glass chimney stained amber. The kettle hadn't whistled in days, and on that table, in the soft morning light, rested a leather-bound notebook swollen with years of entries, its spine bent, its pages warped by oil and rain and fingerprints. The last page lay open. The ink hadn't yet fully dried. I was kept. The line was simple. sharp, final without feeling like an end. In the window, the curtain stirred. Just once. Then went still. When the local soil team came up from Asheville that fall to study a section of the mountain that had begun to shift near the southern ridge, land they'd always thought too stable to worry about, they were told to check the old paths near the tree line by the old fire cut. Nothing urgent, just precaution. The storms had been heavier that year, and locals muttered about new sounds at night, hollow spaces in the rock. 2 men and a woman made the hike just past dusk, their packs heavy with measuring rods, soil tubes, notebooks they still believed might matter more than instinct. They reached the cabin at twilight. It sat hunched beneath a veil of fog, like a chapel without windows. The front steps were damp with moss, the wood darker than they'd expected. The door was closed, but not locked. They called out. No one answered. The first woman stepped inside. Her boots echoed on the floorboards. The air was dry, touched with lavender and wood smoke and something older, something like time pressed into the walls. The kitchen was clean, the fire grate cold but swept. On the table, the notebook remained. She didn't open it, just stared at the line in the center of the page, the ink now smudged slightly at the edge like someone's thumb had rested there for a long time. Eye was kept. There were no photos, no family name on the door. Only a thin piece of twine above the mantel, where a braid of wild grass hung beside a row of carefully placed deer hairs, bound together at the base with bark string. On the windowsill, tucked behind a rusted horseshoe, someone had left a pine cone, balanced, not fallen, not blown, placed. The woman said nothing, just stepped back out onto the porch and looked toward the tree line, where mist curled like breath from a sleeping body. That evening, as the sun slid down behind the slope, the 3 researchers began to pack their gear when one of them froze. He pointed toward the far edge of the ridge. Just beyond the trees, 2 shapes stood, tall, motionless. Not shadows, not tricks of light. They didn't move quickly. Didn't vanish like spooked deer. They simply raised their arms. Slow, intentional, not a wave, not threat, just a gesture too human to ignore, a greeting, a farewell, an acknowledgement. The ridge fell quiet. The forest didn't echo. It held. No one chased after them. No one spoke for a long time. Only the wind moved, brushing past like a hand on a shoulder. That night in town, no one asked questions. No one wrote reports beyond what was needed. But when they told the story later, in coffee shops, across porches, over stew and broken corn muffins by wood stoves, there was something reverent in their voices, like they were trying not to touch something fragile with their breath. Word moved slow, the way truth always does when it walks on dirt roads. Folks started calling the stretch of ridge above the cabin something new, not on maps, not in letters, just between each other. Silent Ridge. Some said they could still hear it late at night, a sound like low singing or the hum of a cello strung through mist. Others said it was just the wind, but no one laughed about it. Not here, not anymore. In the months that followed, hikers began to leave small offerings at the cabin steps. Stones stacked 3 high, tiny plats of dry grass tucked between rail slats, feathers wrapped in twine. No one taught them. They just knew that this wasn't a place you passed without remembering how to be gentle, that something had once lived here that saw more than most would ever understand. And in the church at the edge of town, tucked between hymns and gossip, the old women sometimes whispered the story to children too young to remember the fires or the night the mountain trembled, about a woman who healed creatures most folks feared, and how one night in the middle of a storm, something walked out of the woods to return what she'd once saved. They never named her. They didn't need to. The truth sat too deep for names, and deep in the hills, under trees older than any clock, the forest remembered. Every braid, every gesture, every whisper of kindness made without witness. The porch remained. The flowers grew wild again. And one morning, years later, a boy walking alone down the ridge path paused when he saw something move in the clearing. He said it wasn't a bear, said it wasn't a man either, just tall, still, with eyes that caught the light like river glass. The boy didn't run, just stood, and the figure lifted a hand, slow and low, and pointed toward the cabin. The boy found the porch swept, a cup of water left near the steps, a braid of grass tucked inside the door frame. No sign of anyone else, just a feeling he couldn't name. He never spoke of it again, but he came back every year, left a single pine cone on the windowsill. In time, others did too, and the cabin stood, not abandoned, not claimed, just kept. Some stories don't end. They simply grow quiet, out in the stillness where pine meets sky. There are truths that don't need to be spoken aloud. Truths that live in the hush of a mountain after rain, or the warmth of a hand held in silence. Stories like this one don't exist to dazzle or frighten. They exist to remind us that something sacred still lingers in the forgotten places, far from the noise of the world, where kindness is offered without witness and protection is given without reward. Because maybe what matters most isn't what we can prove or capture or name. Maybe it's what we choose to believe in the quiet, in the pause, in the space between fear and mercy. That small, trembling space where we decide to see each other not as threats, but as beings capable of care. There's a kind of grace in knowing you were never truly alone, in realizing that even when the world felt too loud, too broken, too far gone, something out there was watching, not to judge, not to punish, but to keep. We live in a time where so much is recorded, shouted, broadcast, but the most important things often go unseen. A gesture, a hum, a braid of grass left at a doorstep. Sometimes the deepest truths don't roar. They simply stand with you in the dark and stay until morning. And maybe that's the point, that in the heart of wilderness, whether it's the woods or the spaces inside us, we still have the chance to offer shelter, still have the choice to be kind, even when no one is watching. And when we do, the world changes, quiet as breath, deep as roots. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, remember, or feel, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear what it stirred in you. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, quiet, human, and full of wonder, please like, subscribe, and follow the channel. Your presence here means more than you know. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and listen close. Somewhere the forest remembers.